The thing that I like to do at this point in the course, as we are finishing up our discussion of the High Middle Ages, and I think we probably left a number of things out, but hopefully given a pretty full view of the society, the culture, the politics, economics, certainly the religious development. To kind of cap all of this, I'd like to talk about, or sort of paint the picture for you of three medieval views of the universe. One of the tendencies in the Middle Ages is toward order. The desire to order society both conceptually and practically. We've talked about the different orders of society, those who fight, those who pray, and those who work. And certainly there were shifts in these sorts of things, but there was always this conception that the world and the universe is divided up into these fundamental parts. Some of this in the intellectual world is taken from Aristotle, who was all about categorization and creating proper taxonomy and these sorts of things. But that tendency shows up in some cultural products as well. And I would like to take a look at a few of these, which will tap us into some of the kind of the heights that people in the 13th and early 14th century were able to achieve in the production of culture, philosophy, literature, and things like art and architecture. The first of these views of the universe comes in the form of the scholastic Summa, and specifically the masterwork of the greatest of the scholastics, or at least the most famous, the most prominent of the scholastics of the High Middle Ages, and this is St. Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican. He was the student of another Dominican named Albertus Magnus. He was originally from Italy, but spent his most productive years, we might say, at the University of Paris, though he did travel around to some other places as well. And his largest work is called the Summa Theologiae, or Summa Theologica. And this is his attempt to describe everything that is of importance in the universe in a single work. Now, this work runs thousands of pages. And Thomas, who died when he was only 49 years old, it should be said, and so he was younger than I am now when he passed away, seems to have spent the last many years of his life night and day dictating to an army of scribes. There was just so much going on in his mind that he had to get it all out, and he even created a shorthand writing system that would allow his scribes to write more quickly, and we even have some manuscripts, probably in places like the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, of these documents that are written in the Thomas Aquinas shorthand. Okay, so it's impossible to encapsulate this entire work or even to describe its contents in short form. Suffice it to say that he tried to deal with everything. He tried to describe everything in the universe, to explain it theologically and philosophically, to put everything in its proper order. He is carrying to the nth degree both the project of Aristotle and the tendency towards systematizing theology that began with figures like Peter Abelard and continued into these great scholars of the late 12th century like Peter the Lombard. Thomas Aquinas is just carrying that out to its logical conclusion, it should be said. And when he finished this, the reaction to, and really he died quite young still. He seems to have had a mystical experience at the end of his life that caused him to have a pretty low opinion of the things he had written before. He even described all of that as just simply straw compared to this much grander vision of God's purpose that he seems to have been shown or claims to have seen, which is a really interesting point. But there was a great deal of optimism about what Thomas had accomplished. Similar in some ways, I think, to the optimism that surrounded the the discoveries of somebody like Isaac Newton, right? That we've nearly got the whole universe figured out was the sentiment there, at least for a generation or so. And in short order, Thomas, many of his ideas were held up to scrutiny and found wanting, and some of them were even deemed heretical by scholars who came after him, and it seems that was perhaps the inevitable fate of somebody as prominent as Thomas and who wrote on as many things as Thomas did. The excerpt that Geary has given us here is from early in the work. It's one of the first questions that he asked, and the reason that I want to go through this briefly is to show his approach to things, right? So this is a model of the universe. He is attempting to explain everything philosophically, but he goes about it through this very strict and exhaustive and rigorous method of exploring, right? That begins with asking questions. If you recall from looking at the brief excerpt from the Seek et Non of Peter Abelard, right, he pointed out that there were contradictions in the writings of the Church Fathers, and we should use our reason, our rational capacities to explain those contradictions, not to shy away from them, but to start with that, right? By the time Thomas Aquinas came along, a little over 100 years later, scholars were embracing this method, right? To find a contradiction, to find a place where the authorities seem to disagree with each other, or where perhaps reason may be set against authority. And then the project, really the challenge, is to work all of that out philosophically. And so take a very simple question. Actually, it's not a very simple question. It's a question, though, that has animated people over the centuries, right? Is there a God? And that's where Thomas goes with this in Article 3 of the Summa Theologiae. And he starts out by saying something that sounds shocking if we consider this is written by a 13th century Christian author, right? It seems that there is no God, he says. Why does he say that? Well, reason would dictate that. For if of two mutually exclusive things one were to exist without limit, the other would cease to exist. So if we have a limitless thing, then it nullifies the existence of anything else because it would occupy all of the limits. Okay? And especially something that's mutually exclusive. But by the word God is implied some limitless good. If God then existed, nobody would encounter evil, but evil is encountered in the world. God therefore does not exist. And that is an explanation that a lot of people have come up with for why they don't believe in God, right? I mean, Thomas is exploring something that seems to have come to a lot of people, both in the Middle Ages perhaps, and especially in the modern day. He goes on to give a second reason why one might not believe in God, okay? Actually, it's not about believing in God, it's like rationally explaining that God does not exist. There really is little belief involved in this. We have moved a long way past Anselm's faith-seeking understanding approach. Moreover, if a few causes fully account for some effect, one does not seek more. It seems that everything we observe in this world can be fully accounted for by other causes without assuming a God. Thus, natural effects are explained by natural causes and contrived effects by human reasoning and will. There is therefore no need to suppose that a God exists. Okay, and this is what many atheists, in fact, today would even say. Like, we can explain everything in the universe without bringing God into the explanation, right? So, therefore, we do not need to bring God into the explanation. Everything is accounted for. Okay, but then Thomas gives a contrary, right? So he has given two explanations for why God does not exist. But then he gives a word of authority. And here's the interplay between reason and authority. On the other hand, the book of Exodus represents God as saying, I am who I am. In other words, the authority, the Bible, testifies in the mouth of God himself that God exists. Okay? That's just the opening part of this, right? The part that is legitimately Thomas, and this is how he proceeds. So he starts with a contradiction or a problem that needs to be worked out, right? Asking a question, going through both potential sides of this, usually presenting the the argument that he doesn't ultimately accept first, using authority. And then the part that is authentically him is the reply, right? And then he replies by saying there are 5 ways in which one can prove that there is a God. Now, I'm not going to take you through these proofs, but the word prove is important here, right? A proof is a logical exercise. I think I had mentioned this when we talked about Anselm's ontological proof of the existence of God. A proof is a logical exercise that starts with propositions that one can accept and proceeds logically to combine those propositions to make steps toward an ultimate conclusion that if all of the steps are in order, if they are all logical and sound, the conclusion must be accepted. It is so mathematically precise. And that is what Thomas is trying to do here, to prove logically that there is a God. And I suppose you can go through this and decide whether he has succeeded in proving logically that that is the case. There are 5 different approaches, and they are really quite different. It's not merely restating the same thing for the existence of God. And then after that, he then responds to the initial objections to the idea that there is a God, right? So we have number 1 and number 2 here. He goes back to this, and using a kind of combination of authority and reason, he then responds to these things and ultimately is able to dismiss the objections and leave with the conclusion that there is a God. And then he moves on to the next thing. And again, we only have a tiny excerpt of this massive tome or massive compendium of philosophical proofs that Thomas gives, right, for everything. He starts with God. He moves through the various classes of heavenly beings. He talks about important doctrines like the incarnation and the virgin birth. He moves through the sacraments. He deals with questions of things like transubstantiation. This is very much a marriage, by the way, of Aristotle with Christian theology. He is taking an Aristotelian approach here. He is using Aristotle's methodology and at times even Aristotle's words, right, or perhaps commentaries on Aristotle in the form of, like Ibn Rushd or the great Muslim commentator whose work was known to Thomas. So that's the first model of the universe, right? This philosophical mapping of everything that belongs in the universe, starting with God and moving through all other considerations. A second model of the universe comes in the form of churches, and specifically cathedrals. Now, the dominant architectural form of the 11th and most of the 12th century is this thing called Romanesque, right? It's called Romanesque because it picks up on Roman forms, particularly the rounded arch, which was beloved of Romans. The thing about rounded arches is that they are not the best weight-bearing structures, right? So you can see that this building is made up of a lot of stone. The walls are very thick. The windows are very small because most of the building, its support relies on thick walls, and there simply is no room for windows. But with all of that stone, there is a good opportunity for decoration in the form of sculpture. And so Romanesque churches were used to display the universe in stone and in color. And that's one thing that is lost in most Romanesque architecture that is simply weathered and faded over the ages. Most of this statuary, the stonework, was covered in paint. And the paint, the colors itself, would have been extremely vibrant and would have been significant in their choice. There are a few sculptures left that continue to have a little bit of the color, so we get a decent sense of this, right? But Romanesque architecture is very much like fortress architecture. It's thick walls, it's rounded arches, it's small windows. The buildings are quite dark inside. One of the things about Romanesque architecture too is it's done, at least in certain parts of Europe, particularly in places like southern France, northern Spain, in response to the demand for pilgrimage churches. Every stop along the Santiago, the path to Santiago de Compostela, the Chemin de Saint-Jacques, or the Camino de Santiago, was populated with churches, each of which had the relics of some saint in them, right? And so you can see here the rounded apse. The apse is usually at the east end of a church, and it's, contained within the apse is the altar, and there would have been relics on display inside the apse. The rounded apse is important because it gives a little path for pilgrims to walk around the altar, to see it from all sides, to get close to the altar itself with the relics that are contained thereon, to venerate the saint, and probably to give donations to the church so it can continue its existence, right? And this was, part of the penitential practice of pilgrimage, and part of what kept this whole tourist trade going in the Middle Ages. This is another church in southern France, but you can see that to some extent you even get the diffusion of like Byzantine styles to the west. This is a Romanesque church, but it has the domes there on it. Here is the interior of Santiago de Compostela itself, and one of the reasons that I show this is not merely to show how dark it is inside these churches. You can see the windows are very small. The barrel vaulting, you have this rounded arch all the way down the nave of the church, but also to show that all of these columns and things probably would have been painted in the Middle Ages. This would have been richly decorated, even with the very little light that gets inside, and that simply has been lost. The grandest, probably the largest Romanesque church ever built was Cluny, the number 3 church at Cluny, and I already talked a little bit about Cluny, but I just want to give you a sense of kind of the scale of this thing. You can see it has a double transept. This thing was absolutely massive. I have walked from here to here, at least where that was, and it is a good distance, right? It's something like, I can't remember it, but it's the very, very long apse here, a very long nave, I should say, with a double transept. You can see the rounded apse here. The thing on display here would have been the community of monks, though, instead of relics. They did have some relics, but they weren't necessarily the most important relics. But this, the grandest Romanesque church, unfortunately, this was mostly destroyed during the French Revolution. Romanesque sculpture. Sometimes it's quite simple, but there were techniques developed to show important ideas, right? So here we have a simple scene of Adam and Eve being tempted by the devil. Actually, the devil is represented twice here. You can see the snake winding around Eve's arm as she's eating the fruit. Adam is about to take the fruit, right? But the devil is also represented in humanoid figure. The evil nature of the devil is usually shown by scarification of the face, or I like to say that the devil doesn't get any sleep, right? So he's got massive bags under his eyes here. But there's usually some distortion of the face to represent evil in Romanesque architecture. And this is tremendously creative, right? You can see that capitals are often decorated with things like serpentine patterns or floral patterns, or even faces sort of sticking out of these things, right? So Romanesque, the capitals, meaning the tops of columns, were a spot for a lot of decoration, sometimes even for telling whole stories, like the parables of Jesus or something like that, or possibly even something from classical mythology would make it onto the capitals of these Romanesque churches. Perhaps most importantly was usually in over the west door of the church was a display of judgment. And so you can see Christ sitting in judgment. This is at the Abbey Church of Vézelay in northern Burgundy. This is actually, I think Vézelay today is in the district that includes Paris. So it's not that far from Paris. But you can see the procession of souls here to be judged. Last Judgment scenes were all over the place. This is one I've worked on personally and written on. This is the Church of Saint Lazare at Autun. And you can see displayed here certain personalities who are headed for judgment, some of them for exaltation in the kingdom of God, so to speak. Here we have a couple of pilgrims with their satchels. I could show you a little more close-up of this, but I don't want to belabor the point necessarily. The one standing right behind them is wearing chainmail and has been identified by scholars of iconography as a crusader, right? And so the message is pretty obvious. Those who do things like go on pilgrimage, go on crusade, Autun was an important spot for both of these things, will go to heaven, whereas, and this is the figure that I've done a little work on, this is a figure who's cutting up what seems to be a Eucharist wafer, right? So somebody who denies the Eucharist, denies the doctrine of the real presence of the Eucharist, or who divides the body of Christ. This could be one of two things that aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, right? There's a lot of schism in this period. There were anti-popes, and there were attempts to divide bishoprics, and so the clear message of this seems to be: do not divide the body of Christ, either symbolically or literally, because if you do, you will end up damned. Okay, and the ones who guard against this are figures like bishops, these ones holding these shepherd crooks or bishops, and they are on the side of the saved. And then up here you have the saints welcoming people into heaven, which is shown as a Romanesque church, right? There's Romanesque architecture in heaven, whereas over here you've got demons, some of whom are reaching down already even before the judgment. You can see these two hands grasping the head of this person, but then herding them into the mouth of hell, which is represented here. This may be the richest one. I think I've already shown this, but one of the reasons I like to put the image of the judgment panel of the Church of Sainte Foy of Conques is to show the color, right? You can still see the blue that Jesus is decorated with in this, and a little bit of the blue. You got some red and yellow and things like that in here as well. So a little sense of like the colors that would have been displayed here as well. In some cases, frescoes do survive in things like the Church of the Nativity, which is a Romanesque church. This was built by Crusaders in the 12th century. But then, this is in the East, and so they're using mosaics really borrowed from the Greek tradition. Now, there's a real shift in the second half of the 12th century to this new style of architecture, which at the time was called modern architecture. The term Gothic was applied only in the 19th century to this, really as a pejorative. Gothic meaning Germanic and barbarian, and that was by contrast with what came after this, which was, of course, Renaissance humanist architecture, which went back to the symmetry and the clean lines of antiquity, took its inspiration from that, and things like Florence Cathedral are representative of that new aesthetic, right? Gothic, by contrast, is busy, messy, and extremely elaborate. And it gets more and more elaborate over time, right? To the point where we have this thing called flamboyant Gothic, which is just every inch of every building in flamboyant Gothic is decorated with something, either stonework or stained glass or paint or something like that. Okay, so the busyness and the messiness of it was objected to by those who thought that Renaissance architecture was just much better. I think personally that's rubbish, but that's my own opinion. The first building built with this in mind was the Abbey Church of Saint Denis, which, by the way, is where Peter Abelard spent some time after his tragedy, right, after his castration. This is part of Saint Denis over here. This is actually Cologne Cathedral in Germany. You can see what they're going for here. And this is really how the Gothic cathedral becomes a model of the universe. The metaphor they're going for here is light. And because Gothic ditches the rounded arch and chooses to use a pointed arch, and you can see the pointed arches here, you can, of course, see them here, along with the cross vaulting and these supports in the cross vaulting, these bosses. Of course, the outside of the building then has exterior supports called flying buttresses that hold up the weight of the building as well. I'll show you some of those. And they need the wall, the necessity of having these really thick walls and just stone everywhere is nullified. And in the gaps between the arches, they can put big windows and they can color them. They can use the windows as the key artistic space. And in the windows especially, right, we find the attempt to depict the entire universe and all of salvation history. So here is Saint Denis. Actually, the lower parts of this are built with Romanesque. It's really the eastern end, the apse, and part of the upper reaches that are built in Gothic fashion. You can see the rose window here, which is a typical feature of Gothic architecture. So this is the first attempt, and it's a kind of hybrid building, but you do see on the apse end here the stained glass, right, and the these arched rib vaults coming together to support the weight of the structure, so they can put these windows in between. In my opinion, the archetypical Gothic building is Chartres. This is about 50 miles south of Paris, and you can see the layout of it here, right? This is a building that's developed over time. The initial phase of this is 13th century. This is a 13th century tower on the southwest end of it. The northwest tower is 15th century. So you can see how much more elaborate it gets over time. This is more in the tradition of like flamboyant Gothic. This is the earlier Gothic. Several rose windows. The rose is a symbol of the Virgin Mary, and so these windows tend to display Mary or some aspect of her. There still is stone, but the stonework is usually a good deal simpler. And here you have Jesus. This is a judgment scene still. This is actually on the south side of the church. This is still a judgment scene, but Jesus is surrounded by just the four evangelist animals, and then we have the 24 elders of Zion. So this is a scene from the Book of Revelation, but it is not quite Last Judgment like we saw in Romanesque, and it's moved to a different facade in this case. The windows. This is the figure of the different windows in Chartres, okay, and I could go on at some length about the windows. But this is an attempt to display the whole of salvation history, right? If you start at the west end and go through the north side, you'll see depictions from the Old Testament. And so beginning with creation, proceeding through things like the flood and the Exodus. By the time you get over here, you're into the New Testament, and you have the parables of Jesus and other things. At this end, fittingly, right by the altar, we have the depictions of the Passion of Christ, the crucifixion, the resurrection. And then over here we have the hagiography of different saints' lives, including famous windows of the Virgin Mary and other saints. There's even a whole window devoted to the deeds of Charlemagne and Roland and people of that age. And so, salvation history presented in full in an attempt to encapsulate everything in its own way, very much like Thomas Aquinas did with the Summa Theologiae, just in artwork and in architecture. And the building itself, if we can go back to just looking at the, kind of down the nave of one of these, right? The crypt, which would have been underneath, is representative of the underworld, even of hell, of the grave. The upper reaches of this are symbolic of heaven with light streaming in. That signifies the presence of God. And then, of course, the altar is where where heaven and earth meet, where God becomes human, becomes man in the form of the consecration of the Eucharist on the altar, where the body of Christ, the bread is transformed into the body of Christ. God takes that form, and then it is distributed to the faithful in the communion. And so the whole universe depicted here. Here's some examples of windows from Chartres, just for fun. This is Noah's Ark. Love the colors here. Actually took pretty much all these pictures. Spent a whole day in Chartres one day, and had a great time looking at all these windows, so highly recommend that. This is actually from the prodigal son window, so one of the parables of Jesus. Here we have the prodigal son losing all of his money on gaming. He's playing chess, or maybe this is like checkers or some gambling thing or something like that here, right? Here we have, this is from the Charlemagne window. This is this figure, I believe, is Roland, or maybe it's this guy. I think it's this one. And he is jousting against a Muslim opponent over here, right? So, the legend of Charlemagne. This one's actually, I did not take this one. You can see the copyright thing over the top of it here. I do have pictures of this, but I don't think any of them were as good as the ones I was able to find on the internet. This is the famous Blue Virgin of Chartres window. This is a depiction of the Virgin Mary, the Madonna and Child. Mary wearing her typical blue gown. One of the more famous windows. You can see the Holy Spirit descending there. Here's one of the rose windows, along with these lancet windows that are underneath it. I forget which one this is, but you have the Madonna and Child in the center here, and then these are the Old Testament prophets, I believe, who surround that. And then one of the things about this, though, is also in the kind of the margins of these windows. And again, this is not one I took, but these windows were funded by different people in the city of Chartres itself. Here we have a shoemaker shown, and this is a window that was the shoemakers raised funds to make this window, to hire an artist to do this window, and we have several of in fact, pretty much all of the guilds of Chartres itself represented in these. Here we have the wheelwrights, you have things like the vintners, you even have bankers and money changers and things like that displayed, right? So you get society represented here as well in really interesting ways. Here's maybe the best example of flying buttresses, though, of course, this is before Notre Dame de Paris burned. And so I think that they were able to save most, if not all, of the exterior supports. It probably still looks like this, although the roof has been, of course, replaced. Real tragic stuff there for sure. Gothic is able to achieve these tremendous heights. Salisbury Cathedral is one of the highest towers of any Gothic building. This is in England, of course. And some of these buildings, just so you can see the elaboration of these. This is Reims Cathedral. These are actually statues depicting the different kings of France, because this is the coronation side of the French kings traditionally. Sainte-Chapelle, the personal chapel of the kings of Paris, the kings of France, I should say. And this is another one of these that shows the whole of salvation history in one single room, right? Old Testament, New Testament, Passion of Christ, saints' lives depicted all through here. Every inch of this building, every possible surface is covered with some kind of decoration, whether that be stained glass, paint. You can see the fleur-de-lis up here representing the royal house of the kings of France. Truly an amazing building. It's one that's easy to miss in Paris. People tend to go to Notre Dame and they miss Sainte-Chapelle, even though Sainte-Chapelle, I think, it's much smaller, but in many ways it's more spectacular. This is just another example of the elaboration. This is Bath Abbey in England. You can see what's called fan vaulting, right? So the vaulting itself gets more elaborate over time. Okay, last model of the universe, and I'm not sure how long I've gone on here, but I'm just going to finish this up. Dante Alighieri, of course, his most famous work is called The Divine Comedy. The word divine is only added a couple of centuries after this. It was called, and he called it himself, the Commedia, right? Why is it a comedy? There's not a lot of laughs in this thing. Well, it ends well, right? The Pilgrim, which is, Dante himself as the storyteller, makes it to the presence of God, and his sins are forgiven, and he is raised to understand God, at least in some way that he is able to do so, right? But in doing this, Dante attempts to depict the entire universe, this time in a poem. And it's a poem about redemption. It's a poem about the process of salvation. It is in its own form exactly, or in a similar way, I should say, the same project that Thomas Aquinas was approaching philosophically, that the designer of a Gothic cathedral would think of in architecture and in art. Dante is doing this with a literary work in this case. Dante was from Florence. This depiction of him is from sometime after his life. I think it's like late 14th or early 15th century or something like that. Domenico Micheli is the artist showing Dante, trying to understand Dante, and one of the things you get here is Florence Cathedral, which was not finished, or not even, Brunelleschi's dome was not built in his day. But some things that are in Florence were, like the baptistry, which is just outside of the Duomo, was around during Dante's time, right? So you can get a sense of Dante's Florence a little bit. Florence, like other Italian cities, was riven by this contention between those who supported the emperor and those who didn't. And the ones who didn't support the emperor, the Guelphs, tended to side with the papacy. And Dante himself, when he was in his 20s, fought on the side of the Guelphs at a key battle called the Battle of Campaldino, and the Guelphs defeated the Ghibellines and effectively rendered them extinct. And this, of course, is a time when the emperors were extremely weak anyway. So this, in some ways, was the final death knell for the imperial faction in Italy. But shortly after that, the Guelphs broke into two factions called the Whites and the Blacks. The Whites felt that Florence should govern itself and should not be subject to too much interference from the papacy. The Black faction thought otherwise and was allied with the popes. And the other thing that happened to Dante early in his life was that he fell in love with a girl named Beatrice Portinari, who he probably never had a meaningful conversation with. He grew up, got married to a woman named Gemma Di Manetto Donati, and had several children by her. Beatrice also grew up, got married, died in childbirth when she was in her early 20s, but she remained Dante's muse for the rest of his life. He never wrote any poems about his wife, but he wrote lots of things about Beatrice, right? So she remains this inspiration for him. This is the classic kind of romance trope of the unattainable woman. When Dante was about 35, 36 years old, so this is around 1301, Boniface VIII had allied with a member of the French royal family named Charles of Valois, really frustrated with... So the white Guelphs were in control of Florence, and they had exiled many of the black Guelphs, and in response to this, Boniface was trying to aid the black Guelphs, and so he had allied with Charles of Valois, and there were rumors that he was going to send Charles to attack the city of Florence and to remove the whites from that. And so the white faction sent a delegation to Rome, headed by Dante, to meet with Pope Boniface VIII, who was already somewhat notorious. Shortly after this, that Boniface has his contention with the French King Philip IV, right? So he is a really belligerent pope who believes in the strength of papal power, in the Plenitudo Potestatis, which we talked about earlier. And while Dante was there, Boniface actually dismissed everybody in his delegation except for him, but then he refused to meet with him. He kind of kept putting him off, and this bought time. Dante didn't realize this, but it bought time for Charles of Valois to maneuver himself into position. He did attack the city, allied with the black Guelphs, and overthrew the white Guelphs, and took control of the city. And Dante found himself being the subject of a sentence of exile. Initially, this was only 2 years, but it came with a hefty fine. Dante was in no position to pay that fine, and this was later extended to exile for life. And Dante never went back to Florence. He traveled around. He went to France for a while. He spent time in various Italian cities. He spent the last few years of his life in the city of Ravenna, and he's actually buried there in a rather modest tomb, okay? There is an empty tomb in Florence, actually in, which church is it? It's the Franciscan church in Florence, I think. But, Dante's not there, right? And Florence has tried over the years to get him back. They even lifted the sentence of exile in 2008. 700 years after it happened, right? I guess to make peace with the ghost of Dante or something like that. But what did Dante do in response to this? Well, he did what any self-respecting poet would do. He wrote about it. And his work, The Divine Comedy, has him beset by sin, struggling in this midlife crisis where he's been exiled from his city. Dante never says this is autobiographical, but really we can tell he's working through this himself. He is, it starts out in a dark wood. He's traveling, he's lost. So metaphorically, that's what's happened to his life. He's chased by some beasts, which are symbolic representations of different sins. And also, one of them is a she-wolf, so representative of Rome itself. Dante then proceeds through the wood, running away from these beasts, and he runs into the ancient Roman poet Virgil, the author of the Aeneid. And this is Dante's hero, right? And so Virgil then says, well, look, you can't go back that way. The beasts are going to block your way. They're going to get you. And so you need to come with me. In fact, I have been sent by Beatrice, who cannot come herself because you're so far removed from her given your sins, that you can't be in her presence, but she has sent me to rescue you. You need to come with me. I'm going to take you through hell and through purgatory, and then I will, take you into the... If you manage to make it that far, I will conduct you into the presence of Beatrice, and she can take you to heaven, right? And so Dante, in the 3 canticles of the Divine Comedy, first visits hell, and hell is structured as a series of concentric spheres, or circles, I should say, terraces, we might say, descending into the center of the earth. And at the very bottom of this is Lucifer, or Satan himself, trapped in the ice at the very center of the world, where he fell when he was cast out of heaven, right? And over the course of visiting these different circles of the Inferno, Dante meets both historical and literary, we might say mythological figures, who were not worthy, or who were cast out of the presence of God, who were in hell for various reasons. Some of them are there only because they were not Christian, like Virgil himself is in the first circle of hell, which is simply called limbo, and they're not suffering there, but they're also cut off from God because they were not Christian, right? And there's way too much to say here to describe this in any kind of detail. But we get a really good sense of Dante's view of what sin is, and some of this has to do with politics, right? If you betray your city, for instance, or your friends, or your benefactor, your lord, right? Those are the very worst kind of sins. Those are the ones that would land a person in the 9th circle of hell down here in the realm of Satan himself. Once Dante and Virgil pass through, they ascend out onto the southern hemisphere, where there's an island with a massive mountain on it, and this is purgatory. Purgatory, of course, the place where those who are guilty of sin, but not sin enough to land them in hell, these would be considered venial sins instead of mortal sins, are sent to suffer, but the suffering will eventually cleanse them of this, and they will be able to make it into heaven after that, right? So Dante starts with what's called anti-purgatory here, the excommunicants and, those who were negligent and were not shriven before they died, finally into the gate of purgatory, and then up the mountain. Each terrace has one of the 7 deadly sins that, is being punished there, and the punishment fits the crime. But the difference here is that this is a community suffering together. Actually, the model for purgatory is the monastery. And they're suffering together to overcome their weaknesses, which all have to do with love, either bad love, not enough love, or too much love. That's kind of the organizing principle here, and they can eventually make it. And at the top of purgatory is the earthly paradise, the Garden of Eden. Dante sees the trees of paradise here, and he's met here by Beatrice. Virgil just leaves him suddenly, and Dante's upset with that. He didn't even say goodbye. But he's taken by Beatrice. He is kind of rebaptized and cleansed and sanctified in the rivers of paradise. And from there he ascends into paradise itself. And this is where we get the concentric spheres of the heavens as conceived by the Middle Ages, right? Starting with the moon, then Mercury, then Venus, then the sun. The earth, of course, is at the center of this. And then the realm of God is at the edge of the universe. This is Aristotelian in that there is a prime mover, the primum mobile, which moves everything else, but the primum mobile is really just the love of God, right? And Beatrice takes him here. She is part of the court of the Virgin Mary, who is right next to the presence of God itself. His last guide is actually Bernard of Clairvaux, who was thought to know God better than any mortal who had ever lived. And he takes Dante into the realm of God. Dante sees God, can't really explain what he sees, tries, fails, but then is moved by the love of God to revolve as God wills around the earth, right? And so that's what Dante ends with, is love, and this is why it's a comedy. But another model of the universe in an age when ordering things like this was just, the order of the day. Okay, sorry this has probably gone on too long, but hopefully that gives you a good sense of these great cultural products and what they were about, and how they fit in with the context of the High Middle Ages.